There are names that survive longer than empires. Names that outlast the collapse of dynasties, the burning of capitals, the redrawing of borders 100 times over. Names that were carried out of Persepolis, out of Susa, out of the highlands of Fars, and somehow, quietly, stubbornly, made it into the present day, sitting in passports and family trees, unnoticed. For centuries, most of these surnames were treated as ordinary, occupational, geographic, a footnote of local history, nothing more. That was the accepted story. Then researchers began comparing the genetic signatures behind these names to ancient burial sites scattered across the Iranian plateau, and the pattern that emerged did not look ordinary at all. It looked like a memory, a biological memory, encoded not in language, not in myth, but in the genome itself. This is the story of 14 surname lineages, the empire they may descend from, and what DNA is now suggesting about who actually survived when Persia fell, and who never really left. For most of modern history, surnames were understood as a matter of administration, not ancestry. Historians believed that Persian family names, especially those formed centuries after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, were largely functional. A name might describe a trade, a weaver, a scribe, a keeper of horses. A name might describe a place, a village near a river, a district in the Zagros Mountains. A name might describe a role within the Zoroastrian priesthood, or later, within Islamic administrative structures. This made sense. Naming systems across the ancient world were rarely built to preserve bloodlines. They were built to organize society. So when linguists traced certain Persian surnames back centuries, some appearing in Sassanid-era tax records, others in early Islamic-era land registries, the assumption was straightforward. These were labels of function, not fragments of empire. 14 of these surnames kept resurfacing across independent historical sources. Names tied to fire temple custodianship. Names tied to old administrative titles once used by provincial tax collectors under the Sassanid court. Names describing a family's role in irrigation management or their position within a guild of scribes trained to read and write in Pahlavi script. On paper, these were simply job descriptions that hardened into hereditary labels sometime after the empire fell, the way surnames formed almost everywhere in the ancient and medieval world. The people carrying these names today were assumed to be, genetically speaking, simply modern Iranians and members of the Persian diaspora, shaped by the same broad regional history as everyone else in the region. Interesting culturally, unremarkable genetically. A linguist could tell you where a name came from. Nobody expected a geneticist to be able to tell you the same thing, using an entirely different kind of evidence. That was the story that held for a long time, repeated in genealogy circles, cultural histories, and the quiet certainty of families who simply assumed their name was inherited the way most names are, as a label, not a lineage. Until someone noticed something the surnames alone could not explain. Researchers working with Y chromosome data, the genetic material passed almost unchanged from father to son across generations, began noticing something odd. Certain surname clusters, especially ones tied to old priestly, administrative, or landholding families, were not showing the level of genetic diversity you would expect from a population that formed the way historians assumed. Instead of blending smoothly into the surrounding genetic landscape over quiet centuries, some of these lineages showed unusually tight, unusually old paternal signatures, signatures that pointed backward, deep into the first millennium BCE, rather than forward into the more recent Islamic period when many assumed these surnames had first crystallized. In other words, the names may have been newer than the empire, but the men carrying them, in an unbroken paternal line, might not have been. That was the first crack. A small one, easy to dismiss as coincidence. Except it kept happening. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what Y chromosome DNA and mitochondrial DNA actually do. Autosomal DNA, the broad genetic material inherited from both parents, gets reshuffled every generation, blending and diluting ancestral signals within a few hundred years. It tells you about a population in general, but it erases fine detail quickly. Y chromosome DNA is different. It passes from father to son with only small mutations accumulating over long stretches of time. Mitochondrial DNA does the same, but along the maternal line. Together, these two markers act less like a blurred photograph and more like a narrow, unbroken thread, one that can, in the right circumstances, be traced back thousands of years without being diluted by every marriage in between. When researchers began sequencing Y chromosome markers from men carrying these 14 historically documented Persian surname clusters, and comparing them against ancient DNA extracted from burial sites associated with Achaemenid and early Sassanid elite-class graves, something unexpected surfaced. Several of the paternal lineages matched, not perfectly, not with theatrical precision, but with a level of continuity that ancient DNA researchers do not see often. The kind of continuity that suggests these were not new families adopting old names for prestige. These were, in a narrow biological sense, the same lines. If this pattern holds, it would not be pretty. It would be personal. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where a name on a passport turns out to be a signal from 3,000 years ago, consider subscribing, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most family trees ever admit. The DNA did not simply confirm what the historical records already suggested. It complicated it in the way real evidence often does. Because if certain surname-linked paternal lines really do trace back toward the Achaemenid and Sassanid periods, that raises an uncomfortable question historians had mostly avoided. How did any lineage survive that long, through that much upheaval, without being erased? Persia was not a stable, sealed environment. It was invaded, absorbed, reorganized, and reinvaded. Alexander's conquest dismantled the Achaemenid court. The Arab conquests in the 7th century CE dismantled the Sassanid state entirely, triggering waves of conversion, migration, and social restructuring that reshaped nearly every layer of society across the plateau. By every reasonable expectation, paternal lineages tied to the old imperial and priestly classes should have been diluted into statistical noise within a few centuries. Populations mix. Elites fall. Bloodlines scatter. And yet the signal persisted in some of these lines. Not loudly, not universally, but enough that researchers could not dismiss it as random. That is not a contradiction. That is a signal. The story did not collapse under this evidence. It widened. At this point, 3 explanations emerged, and none of them could be ruled out immediately. The first explanation is founder effect within closed social classes. Priestly families, particularly within Zoroastrian communities, historically practiced strict endogamy, marrying within their own religious and social circle for generations, sometimes centuries, even after the broader population converted to Islam. A closed, small population like this can preserve a distinct paternal signature far longer than an open, freely mixing one, simply because there are fewer new lineages entering the pool to dilute it. The second explanation is regional isolation. Certain mountainous districts in the Zagros Range and parts of central Iran remained relatively insulated from the major demographic waves that reshaped lowland cities. If a family held land in one of these pockets for generations, intermarrying largely within a local network, their paternal line could preserve older signatures simply through geographic seclusion rather than deliberate exclusivity. The third, and most provocative, explanation is deliberate lineage preservation tied to name adoption. Some historians have proposed that certain families strategically adopted specific surnames precisely because they were already understood, within their community, to descend from older administrative or priestly houses, meaning the name was not randomly assigned function, but a marker deliberately chosen to signal ancestry that was already known and valued at the time. Each of these explanations is plausible. None of them cancels out the others. It is entirely possible that different surname lineages among the 14 studied were shaped by different combinations of all 3 forces. Genetics rarely offers a single clean answer. It usually offers a layered one. There is also a fourth possibility, quieter than the others, that researchers have been careful not to overstate. Some of the continuity could reflect what geneticists call a ghost signal, an ancestral component that entered a lineage once, early, through a single consequential event, and then simply never got fully diluted because the population around it stayed small and regionally contained for long stretches afterward. Not a preserved royal bloodline in any dramatic sense. Just a single old thread that the centuries happened not to unravel. None of these explanations require a fairy tale. None of them require an unbroken line of nobility hiding in plain sight for 2,500 years. What they require is something more modest and, in its own way, more believable, the ordinary mathematics of small, semi-closed populations, repeated patiently across enough generations that a signal from the Iron Age could plausibly still be legible today. The most significant turning point came when researchers expanded beyond isolated Y chromosome comparisons and began working with broader ancient genome panels, comparing autosomal data from Iron Age and early historic burial sites across the plateau against modern samples linked to these documented surname clusters, using far larger reference populations than earlier, smaller studies had access to. This mattered because earlier comparisons had relied on limited ancient samples, which made any apparent match statistically fragile. A single ancient genome can look similar to a modern one by chance. A broader panel, drawing from dozens of sites across centuries, removes much of that uncertainty. The scale mattered as much as the method. Where earlier work had compared a handful of ancient samples to a handful of modern volunteers, the newer effort drew on genome data spanning more than a millennium of burial sites, cross-referenced against modern participants who could document their surname's presence in family or land records extending back at least 6 generations. This was not a study built to find a headline. It was built to survive scrutiny, and that caution is, in this field, usually a sign that the results are worth taking seriously. What the larger dataset revealed was not a simple story of unbroken royal bloodlines quietly surviving into the present, which is the version people often want to hear. It was something more layered and in some ways more interesting. The ancient genetic material associated with elite Achaemenid and Sassanid-era burials already showed significant internal diversity, reflecting a multi-ethnic empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, absorbing Elamite, Median, Mesopotamian, Central Asian, and Caucasian ancestry into its administrative class over centuries. There was no single genetically pure, Ancient Persian signature to trace in the first place. What the modern surname-linked samples showed instead was a partial, patchy continuity with specific components of that ancient diversity, strongest in some lineages tied to priestly or landholding names, weaker or nearly absent in others, despite similar historical documentation. In short, the empire's genetic legacy did not travel forward as one unified thread. It fractured into many, and only some of those threads held. Not every family carrying one of these 14 historic surnames turned out to share the strongest ancient affinities. That was expected. What was not expected was which ones did. Several of the surname lineages with the clearest documented ties to religious or scribal roles, names historians had generally treated as functional labels rather than ancestral markers, showed among the strongest genetic continuity with ancient elite burial samples. Meanwhile, a few surnames long assumed, based on oral family tradition, to carry noble or royal descent showed comparatively weaker and more diffuse ancient signal, more consistent with prestige adoption than direct lineage. The surprise was not simply that some names carried deeper ancestry than others. The surprise was that the deepest signals were not always found where the loudest family stories claimed them to be. The genome was not confirming the legends people already told about themselves. It was quietly correcting them, and in a few cases, validating names nobody had thought to romanticize at all. This is bigger than 14 surnames. What this research suggests, cautiously and without overreaching, is that human ancestry does not move through history the way surnames or national identities suggest it should. It does not travel in one clean line from an empire to its true descendants. It fractures, concentrates in unexpected places, disappears in others, and resurfaces in patterns that have almost nothing to do with which families kept the best stories about themselves. A name is a cultural choice. A haplogroup is a biological record. Sometimes they align. Often they do not. And when they do align, it is rarely for the reasons people assumed. This matters far beyond Iran. It matters anywhere an old empire left behind names, myths, and bloodlines that were never meant to travel together in a straight line, which is to say, almost everywhere. Think of how many surnames on this planet were assigned rather than inherited in the way we imagine. A title given to a village, a trade name stamped onto a household by a distant bureaucracy, a religious designation adopted generations after the fact for reasons of status rather than blood. And then think of how many of those same names, against every statistical expectation, turned out to be sitting on top of something real. Not because the name predicted the ancestry, but because every so often history and biology happen to agree, and nobody notices until someone finally checks. That is the quiet lesson underneath all of this. We built our identities out of language, geography, religion, and memory long before we had any way to check those stories against the genome. Most of the time, the two systems drift apart. Occasionally, almost by accident, they do not. Picture the Zagros foothills at dusk, where terraced villages still catch the last orange light before the mountains fold into shadow. Somewhere in that landscape, for over 2,000 years, small communities held their ground through conquest after conquest, not through resistance, but through quiet continuity. A well maintained, a field replanted, a name passed down without ceremony, simply because it was the name of the father and his father before him. There is no monument to this kind of survival. No inscription, no royal seal. Only the genome, carried forward in silence, indifferent to which empire happened to be ruling above it. That is what the DNA seems to be preserving. Not a myth of unbroken royal blood, but something quieter and, in its own way, more remarkable, evidence that ordinary continuity, sustained over millennia through isolation, tradition, and chance, can outlast the empires that gave it a name in the first place. If a story like this makes you look differently at the names people carry, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which lost lineage or forgotten empire you would want uncovered next. The old story said these were simply Persian surnames, administrative labels from a bureaucratic empire, interesting but genetically unremarkable. The evidence now suggests something more layered. Not a single unbroken bloodline running in a straight line from Persepolis to the present. Something closer to a scattered archive, fragments of an empire's genetic diversity, unevenly preserved, unevenly forgotten, surfacing in specific families for reasons that have as much to do with isolation and circumstance as with any deliberate act of memory. The map historians drew of Persian identity was never wrong, exactly. It was simply too small for what the genome eventually revealed. Empires fall. Borders dissolve. Languages shift, and religions change hands more than once in a single family's history. But somewhere beneath all of that, in the quiet biochemistry passed from father to son, from mother to daughter, something else persisted, indifferent to politics, indifferent to which century claimed to be the important one. The empire ended. The paperwork disappeared. The palaces became ruins that tourists photograph without knowing what they are looking at. But in certain names, carried without fanfare through 15 centuries of upheaval, something of that empire may still be quietly, biologically, alive. The map is still incomplete. It always will be. That is not a flaw in the research. It may be the most honest thing science has ever said about who we are.